It is 8 a.m. in Salisbury, North Carolina, 7 a.m. in Chicago, 5 a.m. in Calaveras County, California, where the news is being made on this Tuesday, September 11th.
From CNN Center in
September 11th, 2001 started off as any other day. Well, not any other day. After all, it isn't any other day that Michael Jordan hints he'll be unretiring, for the second time no less. But for the most part, to the American public, this was just any other Tuesday. However, there was of course one other interesting story developing. A plane leaving Boston's Logan International Airport would be hijacked. On its own, this wasn't really that eventful. After all, plane hijackings weren't really that rare in the 90s and very early 2000s. Despite not being quite as common as at their peak in 1969, with a total of 84, hijackings remained relatively common, at roughly 10 a year. Most of these hijackers were in it for the money, such as the now infamous D.B. Cooper, as well as the many copycats who would follow him. So when a mid-sized Boeing 767 was hijacked leaving Logan Airport, few at all really cared.
Would you like to lower your monthly mortgage payments or use the equity in your home to consolidate your credit card or other debts? Just log on.
Number 2.
Yeah. This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have...
Just 3 minutes after impact, this was the first the public heard about the tragedy. Little was known at first. The handful of people who managed to capture the event wouldn't release their footage for days to years. All the country had to go off of was the wreckage of the South Tower, visible to people and news stations all over New York. But there were some who witnessed the event. Some who, for whatever reason, whether they were stuck in traffic in their morning commute or bored in first period history, just so happened to be looking at the once iconic Lower Manhattan skyscraper. And these eyewitness accounts all said the same thing. A plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. In retrospect, it should have been obvious this was no accident. There is simply no way a trained pilot could make this kind of mistake. The nearest airport was miles away, and although seeing low-flying planes over the Hudson wasn't that rare, seeing them over Manhattan was truly an oddity. It seemed impossible that a mistake like this could have happened, but the alternative was so horrifying, so unthinkable, that it seemed more than impossible. So the narrative was set. It was a freak accident. And for about 20 minutes, the public and TV hosts across the country would speculate on why what was originally described by many as a small commercial jetliner would hit the building. Many would confuse the plane's seemingly erratic trajectory as a desperate attempt to steer the plane shy of the building, where in reality, unbeknownst to witnesses at the time, it was an attempt to ensure it hit its target. One particularly savvy news pundit would compare the crash to a 1945 incident when an American World War II bomber would crash into the Empire State Building, causing millions of dollars in damages in addition to killing about a dozen people. However, this incident would occur under very foggy conditions. In fact, the pilot of the B-25 bomber was warned about visibility when given clearance to land. Alternatively, September 11th had infamously clear skies, which further perplexed speculators. The idea of a plane crash this horrible in these conditions seemed so unlikely that some questioned if there even was a plane, instead blaming a bomb or simply a fire which had gotten out of control somewhere around the 90th floor of the building. Of course, these people were by far in the minority. The number of eyewitness accounts supporting the plane theory was so overwhelming that by now almost all news stations were parroting it. It was simply a once-in-a-generation tragic accident. Nothing more. By now, the event had grown beyond a national news story, and international stations had begun to report on the tragedy. TV networks from Mexico to Japan borrowed footage from their American equivalents. As they watched and began to discuss the disaster, however, these international TV stations weren't nearly as quick to brush off the event as simply an accident. From an outsider's perspective, it was much easier to catch a glimpse of the obvious truth. And these stations began to question if this could have been a deliberate attack. And they wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. You know what happens next, but first, let me go on a brief tangent. Some say that the 90s didn't really end until September 11th. And honestly, I agree. The defining characteristic of the 90s was the optimism about the future, something that died that very day. In the 90s, technology was rapidly evolving. We were in the heart of the third industrial revolution and the birth of the information age. We had gone from cell phones looking like this to looking like this. The Cold War was finally over, our enemies were defeated, and America sat alone on the world stage. We had even patched the hole in the ozone layer. What couldn't we do? Signing of agreements like NAFTA and the formation of the European Union brought waves of new global cooperation and the ultimate creation of a global economy. Many hoped this would mean the end of war itself. And besides an eensy-teensy little war in the Middle East that no one really cared about at the time, this was true. The last time the US had to initiate the draft was in 1973 with Vietnam, and since then, things had only gotten better. For the first time since the 1920s, people looked towards the future with admiration rather than dread. And as we entered the 2000s, and we conquered the Y2K scare and the dot-com bubble, things were looking better than ever.
An effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Some tried to swim.
The 90s were officially over. Welcome to the 21st century.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Okay.
Hold on, I'll tell you what's going on.
You can really hear the fear in these people's voices. It's rare to hear a news anchor break composure, but I don't think I've ever heard an entire news crew react like this in all of my time watching TV. There's a reason so many people can remember exactly where they were and what they were doing that day, when they watched 100 people die in an instant. It really is generational trauma at its best, or worst. It became immediately clear that this wasn't any once-in-a-year tragedy they had just witnessed. This was a deliberate attack. This was no accident. This absolutely broke people. People not just from New York or the Northeast, but all across America. People simply couldn't believe something like this had happened. How could something like this happen here? Americans have this delusion that we're untouchable. After all, our enemies are oceans away, and no one would dare bring us harm. So there's no need to worry about anything bad happening. After all, worrying is hard work, and it's a lot easier to just ignore all that's out there in the world and pretend you're safe. Hell, there hasn't been an attack on our own soil since Pearl Harbor, and even that was in Hawaii. Surely no one would dare attack us on our home soil, in our most sacred city, at our most prized landmark. That's why 9/11 was so devastating and shocking for so many people. It wasn't just a national tragedy, it was the ultimate contradiction to their worldview, and some simply refused to believe their eyes. Since our childhood, we've been told that the good guys always win and the bad guys always get justice. But on this day, this delusion was shattered. We aren't safe, we're not untouchable, and we asked, if they can do this, what else can they do? Unfortunately, many wouldn't have to wait long to find an answer.
There is a lot of confusion here at the Pentagon. It appears that something hit the Pentagon on the outside of the 5th corridor.
Here is where the story really takes it to an 11. When the first plane hit, we thought this was just a horrific accident. When the second plane hit, we learned this was a deliberate attack. But when the third plane hit, we learned that America itself was under attack. The Pentagon is the headquarters of the United States military, with the building's 5 sides, each representing one of its 5 branches. The Pentagon is famously renowned for their security, even being nicknamed the safest place on Earth. The Pentagon is also located just next to what's called the National Mall, a strip of land which harbors both the White House and the Capitol building. Understanding this is critical to understanding the significance of the attack. In the public's eye, an attack on the Pentagon shouldn't even be possible. In addition to having world-class security systems and thousands of military staff on site, the Pentagon also housed the National Security Agency, which should be able to sniff out any potential plot before it could unfold. But of course, this didn't happen, and the world was left horrified. The heart of our military was just attacked. If they could hit the Pentagon, what else could they do? Prior to the attack, the hijacked Flight 77 was within breathing distance of both the White House and the Capitol building, both of which were yet to be evacuated. Congress was still in session, for fuck's sake. Due to the nature of security at the Pentagon, knowledge about the extent of the damage was unclear. Some questioned if we could even be able to mount a defense against seemingly imminent future attacks, with the Pentagon still in shambles. Fortunately, the damage at the Pentagon was not nearly as bad as was initially feared, and orders to the FAA to ground all planes and orders to evacuate the Capitol were sent out. But this only exacerbated the public's fears.
I don't want to incite any undue panic, but there is a report only, of another aircraft that has crashed on Interstate 395, one of the main routes in Washington, D.C. Now, that is
hysteria was truly kicking in. Buildings all across the country were being evacuated, and this panic only bred more panic. In addition to a fourth crash in Somerset, Pennsylvania, several ghost planes had been reported, completely fictitious aircraft attacks that only further escalated the mass hysteria. Tension built and built as we waited and waited for the next attack. But there were no more planes. Many would wake up on September 12th, wondering if this was all a bad dream. But alas, nightmares are not the only things that can be nightmarish. And for many people today, as they ate their breakfast and drank their morning coffee, was when their new reality truly settled in. This was the new status quo. America was under attack, and there was no going back. Many would seek out entertainment as a way to cope. Across New York, movie theaters were filled to the brim. But across the larger United States, many would seek out the burgeoning internet. The internet of 2001 was very different to the internet of today. Instead of the majority of traffic being spread across half a dozen sites as is true today, the internet of the early 2000s was much more decentralized, with traffic being directed to hundreds of individual forums and message boards, each dedicated to their own variety of topics. But of these boards, none were bigger than Newgrounds. While today, we may think of Newgrounds as simply a site for flash games and animations, in 2001, it was really so much more. Newgrounds was in its heyday. People wouldn't come just to watch flash animations. They came for the community, and what was truly the beginning of internet culture. Almost immediately after the attacks hit the news, Newgrounds and other similar sites were overwhelmed with threads and posts on the matter. People shared their personal experiences, mourned the losses of their loved ones, or simply vented. People were filled with shock, horror, grief, and sorrow, but more than anything else, people were angry. They wanted the people who did this to pay, no matter the cost. People wanted revenge. The only question was against who. Many would blame Palestine. In 2001, we were well into the Second Intifada, a large Arab uprising in Palestine against a progressively encroaching Israeli government. The uprising would ultimately result in thousands of casualties, and Palestinian suicide attacks carried out by Hamas were a staple of the news for many years. For many people, it wasn't a huge leap to assume this was yet another one of Hamas's attacks, just this time a far bigger one, targeting one of Israel's biggest supporters. Others would blame Saddam Hussein, whose Iraqi government had lost the Gulf War just years earlier. In addition to having an obvious reason to hate the US, Saddam's Iraqi government was a state sponsor of terrorism and had been linked to smaller attacks in the past. Others still would blame Osama bin Laden, or Usama bin Laden, as his name was commonly romanized at the time. Although bin Laden was nowhere near the peak of his infamy, he was still somewhat well known, largely due to earlier attacks against US embassies in East Africa. But for many, more so than blaming any group or individual, they blamed Muslims as a whole. It's honestly shocking seeing this much blatant racism. Even when you consider that Newgrounds at this time was mostly populated by angsty high schoolers, it's still a lot. Sure, racism wasn't exactly abnormal on the Newgrounds of this era, and this site was painfully edgy, but still, it's a lot. Almost as overwhelming as the racism was the genuine fear that this would escalate into a Third World War. Following the attack, the US military was moved to DEFCON 2 readiness, the highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you weren't one of the people calling for nuking the Middle East back to the Stone Age, you were probably at least a little worried about a potential nuclear war. By September 12th, media became more organized, and news anchors now understood the story they were telling before it came to air. More footage and images were also found, including the now famous falling man photo. Newspapers were released, and lengthy TV segments were written. But really, not much had changed. Just now, you have a little America Under Attack graphic on your TV screen. In addition to identifying who was behind the attacks, the media focused extensively on the situation going down on what was dubbed Ground Zero, the former site of the World Trade Center. At Ground Zero and across New York as a whole, thousands of missing persons posters were put up on windows, buildings, and street corners. But the prospect of finding those lost were grim. Searching of the wreckage was going slow, and when the crew did find people, they were almost certainly long dead. Rescue dogs were reportedly getting so depressed that their handlers had to hide in the wreckage themselves to keep the morale up. Elsewhere in New York, there were record-long lines at blood banks. Tens of thousands of people had shown up and waited in lines for hours, thinking that, in the aftermath of the disaster, thousands would be in desperate need of blood. In reality, though, so few people had survived the attacks that hardly any was needed at all. In fact, in the months after the attacks, over 20,000 gallons of expiring blood would need to be thrown away. In total, only 20 survivors were found in the wreckage of the towers. Meanwhile, in Washington, the United States was undergoing one of the largest governmental reorganizations since the Cold War. Just 11 days after the attacks, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge was appointed the first head of the Department of Homeland Security. This new department would absorb nearly 20 other governmental agencies spanning the executive branch. Agencies such as the Secret Service, Customs Service, FEMA, and even the Coast Guard were all absorbed into this new department. Additionally, the TSA would be established, which would completely overhaul airport security, and to this day cost taxpayers billions of dollars a year, despite not actually stopping one single terrorist attack in its 20-year history. On the legislative side, bills like the Patriot Act were passed, which hoped to take a more proactive approach to counterterrorism. And how would they be doing this? By spying on you. Well, not directly spying on you. That creates too much paperwork. Instead, the Patriot Act makes it far easier for the government to collect information about individuals from third parties. In fact, in addition to doing a number of other things, the Patriot Act gives the FBI the power to force anyone at all, from doctors and colleges to companies and internet service providers, to turn over any information they have about a client. Doing this all without the need of a warrant. You know, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but this sort of seems like it should fall under unreasonable search or seizure. But I digress. By far, the largest governmental focus following the attacks was the identification of who was behind them. Unlike in many other instances of terrorism, where the group behind it would announce that they had committed the attacks, in 9/11, no groups had done so, and thus the identity of the perpetrators was left up to speculation. Much like how the media and general populace had varying opinions on who was behind the attacks, the same was true within the government, and they had more than their fair share of suspects. However, as time passed and more was learned about the attackers, mainly through intercepting phone calls and wire transfers, the number of potential suspects began to get smaller and smaller, and by late September, it seemed that we had found our assailants. More and more information was pointing towards this small Islamist fundamentalist group in Afghanistan, a group by the name of Al-Qaeda. Historically, the region of Afghanistan has been of particular political significance. Over millennia, the region has known a number of rulers. First the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the British. In the early 20th century, however, Soviet leaders began taking interest in the region. Unlike the flat steppes of Central Asia, Afghanistan is quite mountainous, and thus easily defensible. This contrast made the significance of Afghanistan even more clear. Controlling Afghanistan would allow a potential adversary to easily launch an offensive into Central Asia. Because of this, Soviet officials closely monitored the political situation in Afghanistan. For instance, in 1919, when Afghanistan first won its independence, the Soviet Union became the first country to establish diplomatic relations. The Soviet Union would continue attempts to build influence in the region over the following century, particularly after 1973, when after a coup, Afghanistan was re-established as a republic. However, this new government, headed by Mohammad Dab Khan, was wary of Soviet influence in the nation, and was hesitant to further ties between the two countries. Soviet leaders, however, were adamant on having Afghanistan as its political puppet, and would go on to heavily support the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan as it built influence within the country. In 1978, the Saur Revolution, headed by the very same People's Democratic Party, and with ample support of the Soviet Union, would ultimately be successful in establishing a communist state in the region. However, like many other one-party states, this government was wildly unpopular, and by 1979, an all-out war had broken out between the Soviet puppet state and Islamist Mujahideen groups. The Mujahideen was not a unified group. It was made up of at least 7 major subgroups, all of which varied substantially politically and all had very different ideals and motives. Some were monarchists, while others were pro-democracy. Some were more secular, while others were totally fundamentalist. Despite these vast differences, these groups were united behind a common goal of removing the Soviet-backed puppet government. This conflict would come to be known as the Soviet-Afghan War, and it soon became just another facet of the larger Cold War, as the United States and its allies began to support Afghan resistance. In addition to support from the Western world, the Mujahideen would receive support in their struggle from elsewhere in the Islamic world. An influx of money, weapons, and volunteers would come from the rest of the Muslim world to Afghanistan, and these volunteers would come to be known as Afghan Arabs, many of which reached Afghanistan via funding from the Afghan Services Bureau, an organization established by one Osama bin Laden. Osama was one of 52 children, fathered by the Saudi billionaire construction magnate Mohammed bin Laden. After his father would die in a tragic plane crash, Osama, now aged 10, would inherit around $25 to $30 million. He would also go on to study at King Abdulaziz University, where he would study economics and business administration. At university, bin Laden further developed his intense interest in religion. Bin Laden would continue to become more fanatical in his religious zealotry, and by the time the Soviet-Afghan War broke out, bin Laden saw it as his religious duty to do whatever he could to help the Mujahideen of Afghanistan, and he, along with several others, would go on to form the Afghan Services Bureau. Overall, the Bureau played a small role in the war, dispersing approximately $1 million to Mujahideen groups and training a little over 100 recruits. Still, despite bin Laden's massive net worth, the group would heavily rely on fundraising to pay for these efforts. Offices were established across the Arab world as well as the Western one, and the group's de facto leader, Abdullah Azzam, would even go on several fundraising tours across the United States, visiting mosques in New York and St. Louis to Seattle and Los Angeles, in order to support the Mujahideen in their jihad in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen would additionally receive formal support from the United States government. Well, they would until 1988, when the United States and Soviet Union would sign the Geneva Accords, an agreement which called for both countries to formally withdraw from the region. Osama bin Laden and other Mujahideen forces felt absolutely betrayed by this, as US support had been critical in their successes thus far in the war. Although this war was over in the eyes of the US public, it wasn't for the Mujahideen and the people of Afghanistan. And although the Soviet Union had also withdrawn their support for communist forces in the region, these forces still remained, and it would take another 4 years of grueling fighting for the Mujahideen to take control of the region. But Osama bin Laden and other founders of the Afghan Services Bureau would not forget how their American ally had abandoned them. Eventually, however, the Mujahideen would prevail. And following the Afghan Service Bureau's successes in Afghanistan, many higher-ups wanted to expand their operations to include other Islamic struggles in other parts of the world, such as in Palestine and Kashmir. And in 1988, Osama bin Laden and Abdullah Azzam would found Al-Qaeda, which would absorb the older Afghan Services Bureau and expand its efforts to elsewhere in the Islamic world. Importantly, it's around this time that the Gulf War would break out, as Iraq had launched its invasion of Kuwait. It was also seemingly increasingly likely that they would also be invading Saudi Arabia. Today, when you think of major military powers in the Middle East, Iraq certainly doesn't come to mind. However, in the lead-up to the Gulf War, Iraq had amassed an enormous army, and it seemed increasingly likely that their inevitable invasion of Saudi Arabia would be successful. This was of particular interest to Osama bin Laden, who believed this would be a great opportunity to expand Al-Qaeda and garner international prestige, if they were able to help fend off the invading Iraqi army. Bin Laden would formally offer the help of Al-Qaeda to Saudi Arabia's King Fahd. However, this meeting would not go nearly as bin Laden had anticipated. The Saudis' King Fahd would reject Al-Qaeda's offer and instead allow the US to protect the country, and thus, the United States would begin its involvement in the Gulf War. Earlier in this video, I alluded to this as being an eensy-teensy little war. However, this is wrong in 2 ways. For one, according to the US government, this wasn't even technically a war, as it had not received congressional approval as such. And secondly, it was not as eensy-teensy as I originally described. In fact, over 500,000 troops would be deployed within a month. And despite Iraq's impressive army, it was no match for the US's, with Iraq capitulating after a mere 42 days. This was for the most part the beginning of American involvement in the Middle East. And this absolutely infuriated certain Islamic fundamentalists. To bin Laden, It was absolutely despicable that any non-Muslim would step foot on the Arabian Peninsula, a place of incredible religious significance to Muslims. To bin Laden, the idea of American troops being stationed here was absolutely unthinkable. Resentment towards the United States only seemed to grow within Al-Qaeda, and they only seemed to find more and more reasons to hate the country. In addition to deployment of American troops in Arabia and their earlier retraction of support in Afghanistan, many members of Al-Qaeda took issue with the United States' close relationship with Israel, who they saw as an invading crusader state. This would eventually culminate in 1996 when Osama bin Laden would formally declare a fatwa against the United States, essentially a declaration of a holy war, and Al-Qaeda would begin to shift its focus to attacks on the United States. On August 7th, 1998, exactly 8 years to the day of the initial arrival of US troops in Saudi Arabia, massive explosions had been reported at 2 United States embassies in East Africa. 2 men had driven trucks loaded with explosives into the 2 buildings, one in Kenya, the other in Tanzania, and we would soon learn the true scope of the attack, with over 200 people reportedly being killed, and thousands more injured. As the dust cleared, in addition to being shocked at the pure horror and scale of the attack, many across the world were shocked at its precision. 2 separate suicide attacks were conducted 800 miles away within a 10-minute window. This was not like the previous terrorist attacks we were used to at the time. This was an organized and planned attack, carried out by a large number of people. This would be much of the world's introduction to Al-Qaeda, and although it wasn't reported nearly as much as the later 9/11 attacks, at the time, it received substantial media attention, with Osama bin Laden even being mentioned in a New York Times article on the subject. The sheer size of the explosion, which was achieved via crude bombs made of thousands of pounds of fertilizer, oxygen tanks, and dynamite, was a particular amazement to the media. These were some of the largest crude bombs ever detonated. It was clear that Al-Qaeda could pose a legitimate threat, not just in the Middle East, but also in other US regions of interest. It's for this reason that Bill Clinton would launch Operation Infinite Reach, a series of cruise missile strikes on Al-Qaeda sites in Sudan and Afghanistan, just 13 days after the attack. Although these strikes were well received by the public at the time, they were ultimately unsuccessful in achieving their goals of weakening Al-Qaeda and killing Osama bin Laden. In fact, some experts believe the opposite, as the attacks helped legitimize Al-Qaeda in certain circles, particularly with the President of the United States name-dropping Osama bin Laden. Additionally, the strikes themselves were utilized in Al-Qaeda propaganda, portraying the attacks not as a response to the earlier Al-Qaeda bombing, but as an attack on Islam itself. Meanwhile, Osama bin Laden and other higher-ups at Al-Qaeda were jubilant with the successes of the attack. They had conducted many smaller suicide attacks in the past, but none at this scale before. And now that they had gotten a taste of the international spotlight, many in leadership wanted something more, something that would really cement their place on the map and garner them international clout. The only question was what could possibly one-up the East Africa attack. They had already once tried to assassinate Bill Clinton while he was on tour outside the US, but now that Al-Qaeda was a household name, it seems unlikely that they would have another opportunity anytime soon. If they really wanted the spotlight, they would have to do something that no government had done in 40 years: sink an American Navy ship. Their first opportunity would be in the form of the USS Sullivans, an Arleigh-Burke-class guided missile destroyer deployed in the Gulf of Aden at the time. The plan was to load a much smaller boat with high explosives, and then, while the Sullivans was refueling, get close enough that the explosives could be detonated. However, this attack did not go as planned, as they had loaded the boat with too much explosives, and it quickly succumbed to the weight and sank. Al-Qaeda would not have another such opportunity for nearly 10 months, when another destroyer, this time the USS Cole, would again begin to refuel in the Gulf of Aden. This time, though, they would make no such mistake, and the 2 suicide bombers entered the boat with a smaller but still capable load of roughly 700 pounds. As the 2 men approached, they would detonate the explosives and punch a 40 feet wide hole in the Cole and kill 17 American sailors on board. The Cole would not be sunk, but the damage was substantial enough that the Cole would not be redeployed until 2003. Although they hadn't accomplished their goal of sinking the ship, Al-Qaeda was overall satisfied with the attack. Once again, the bar had been raised. How could they possibly top this? They had nearly sunk an American destroyer, for God's sake. Fortunately, they had some ideas. I'm gonna go on a limb here and say you have to be a little crazy to join a terrorist organization, After all, you don't just see everyone putting their lives on hold and making bombs in their basement.
No.
What I'm getting at is the kinds of people who join these organizations often have some ideas. Some absolutely insane ideas. And well, Al-Qaeda had more than their fair share of them. Meet Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Depending on who you ask, Khalid is either an evil genius or a deluded idiot. Khalid got his start in the 80s as a part of the Mujahideen. Although Khalid was not a member of Al-Qaeda, he would still continue the fight for Islam long after the Soviet occupation had been dealt with. In 1994, Khalid moved to the Philippines with his nephew and fellow terrorist, Ramzi Youssef. Khalid and Youssef had previously worked together on a plot in 1993 to destroy the World Trade Centers via use of a car bomb. They hoped that the blast would be large enough to topple the North Tower and send it crashing into the South Tower, destroying both buildings. However, in reality, this was not the case, and although the buildings both sustained substantial damage, they remained structurally intact. Although this attack would receive substantial media attention at the time, today it is of course overshadowed by the 9/11 attacks. Now that Khalid and Youssef were in the Philippines, they were on to another plot. This time, a 3-phase one, which was way more elaborate and frankly nonsensical. And step 1 was, kill the Pope. A suicide bomber, dressed as a priest, was to approach Pope John Paul II's motorcade as he visited the Philippines during the World Youth Day 1995 celebrations. Youssef had trained 20 men for this task, ensuring that at least one of them would be able to get close enough to the vehicle to detonate. So why kill the Pope, you may ask? As a distraction. Now, of course, this plan was never carried out. But come on, seriously? You're going to kill the Pope as a distraction? Come on, this is real life, not the plot of a Mission Impossible movie. So after they had killed the Pope, Youssef and 4 other men are going to plant bombs on 11 planes heading to the United States. 11 planes? 5 men? How is this even possible? Well, this wasn't in fact a suicide mission. The plan was for the men to board the planes and place a timed explosive device under their seat, and then leave, allowing for the bomb to detonate on the plane's next flight, and for the terrorists to board the next plane with the next bomb. This part of the plan could have conceivably worked. In fact, Youssef had even done a test run just to prove the plan's viability. He boarded Philippine Airlines Flight 434 with a variety of parts he would use to construct a small bomb on board. And despite having only 1/10 the power of the planned final bombs, it still managed to do substantial damage to the aircraft, nearly causing loss of the plane and killing 1 man. However, the final bombs would have certainly had enough power to crash the plane. If the full plot were to have been carried out, over 4,000 people would have been killed. But wait, that's just Phase 2. Phase 3 would involve using funds that Khalid had received from Osama bin Laden to purchase a small aircraft. The plane would then be moved to the east coast of the United States, where it would be loaded with explosives before being used in a suicide attack on the CIA headquarters in Fairfax, Virginia. As far as I can tell, this is the first reference to an attack of this kind. There have of course been deaths in commercial plane suicides before, and of course there were Japanese kamikaze bombers during World War II, but before this, there had never been a commercial plane utilized as a weapon. But for Al-Qaeda, using planes really wasn't that much of a jump. Conceptually, the attack was no different than the many car bomb attacks they had done over the years. The only difference being the expense of buying a plane and training a pilot. Although the Bojinka Plot, as it would come to be known, would never be fully implemented, largely due to a fire breaking out in the apartment where Khalid and Youssef were based in, the plan would heavily inspire future Al-Qaeda attacks, most notably 9/11. Following the Bojinka Plot's collapse in 1996, Khalid would return to the Middle East, where he would later have the opportunity to talk to Osama bin Laden. Although the Bojinka Plot was a total failure, Khalid's faith had never wavered, and where many people would have been discouraged by the collapse of the plan, Khalid only became more ambitious. Khalid began to question if the CIA headquarters were really the best target for his destruction. Why not hit the Pentagon and really cripple the US Armed Forces? Or no, why not destroy America's most prized skyscrapers, the Twin Towers, and redeem his and Youssef's earlier failures? Or better yet, why not cut the head off the snake itself and kill the President of the United States by targeting the White House? Khalid would continue to contemplate the best target for his jihad until he had a revelation. Why just one? Surely the great Khalid Sheikh Mohammed could pull it off, especially with a little help from his good pal, Osama bin Laden, and the rest of Al-Qaeda. And at this point, if we're getting Al-Qaeda involved, why even bother buying planes? We don't need to bother with explosives if we can just hijack a jet. By now, Khalid's ambitions had grown exponentially, and his proposal to bin Laden would include a total of 12 planes being hijacked, targeting sites across the United States. These sites being the Pentagon, the White House, the United States Capitol, the Sears Tower in Chicago, the U.S. Bank Tower in Los Angeles, the Trans-American Pyramid in San Francisco, Columbia Center in Seattle, the Prudential Tower in Boston, the Empire State Building, and the World Trade Center. Khalid's plans were ambitious almost to the point of being delusional, and bin Laden would initially brush off his proposal as being non-feasible and too elaborate. Still, Khalid held on to the idea, and as he became a full-fledged member of Al-Qaeda, he would continually bring it up. Until, in 1998, once Al-Qaeda had finally managed to sink the USS Cole, bin Laden was finally convinced the mission was doable, and would begin the early plannings of a heavily scaled-back version of Khalid's planes operation. Unlike the original plan, which called for 12 planes to hit 11 sites across the country, this revised version would be far more manageable, with just 4 planes and 3 targets, all close together in the Northeast. Al-Qaeda would begin recruitment for the project, and in the fall of 1999, training for the attacks began. Recruits would train at the Mez Ainak camp in Afghanistan, where they would be taught simple English and other basic skills. They also used flight simulator games and analyzed airline schedules to figure out flights to target. And in the spring of 2000, after receiving visas, the operatives would travel to the US to begin flight training. By this point, in the fall of 2000, 3 Al-Qaeda pilots were progressing in their training, and an additional 4th man with previous flight experience had been recruited. In the summer leading up to the attack, the pilots busied themselves with cross-country surveillance flights and additional flight training. The 4 men each flew first class, in the same types of aircraft that they would each pilot on September 11th. In addition to the test flights, some of the operatives obtained additional training. In early June, 2 men were able to fly the Hudson Corridor, a low-altitude hallway along the Hudson River that passed several New York landmarks, including, of course, the World Trade Center. In these test flights, the men had been able to carry box cutters onto their planes, and additionally determined the best time to storm the cockpit would be about 10 to 15 minutes after takeoff, when they noticed the cockpit doors were typically open for the first time. In the final days leading up to the attack, in addition to their last test flights, the conspirators had their final preparations to make. Some of the pilots took final practice flights on small wrenched aircraft, and muzzle hijackers, who would accompany them in storming the cockpit, trained at gyms. The operatives also purchased a variety of small knives that they may have used during the attacks. Just 2 weeks before the attacks, the conspirators had purchased their flight tickets. Once ticket purchases were made, the conspirators returned excess funds back to Al-Qaeda, totaling tens of thousands of dollars. The last step was to travel to the departure points for the attacks. The operatives for American Flight 77, which would depart from Dulles and crash into the Pentagon, gathered in Laurel, Maryland, about 20 miles from Washington, D.C. Further north, the operatives for United Flight 93, which was either planned to hit the Capitol building or the White House, were gathered in Newark. During the early hours of September 11th, another group of hijackers cleared security at the airport in Portland, Maine, and had boarded their connection flight that would allow them to join the rest of the Flight 11 and Flight 175 teams at Logan Airport, both heading towards the World Trade Center. On the morning of September 11th, after years of planning and after many months of intensive preparation, all 4 terrorist teams were in their place to execute the attack. A team of 19 men were assembled across 3 different airports. The flights targeted were specifically chosen to be timed closely together, as to reduce the chance of any organized response to the attacks, with all 4 flights cited to take off within a 25-minute window. However, just like anyone else, terrorists too have to deal with flight delays, and both Flight 11 and 175 out of Boston suffered short delays of around 15 minutes, while Flight 77 out of Dulles suffered a delay of just 10. However, Flight 93 out of Newark would be a different story. After originally being cited to take off at 8, it had taken a whole 42 minutes for Flight 93 to take off. Certainly an annoyance to the average passenger, but to Al-Qaeda, it had the potential to become a serious issue. By the time Flight 93 was in the air, both Flight 11 and 175 had been hijacked, and Flight 11 was mere minutes from crashing into the North Tower. By 9:19, local air traffic officials had sent multiple messages to various planes warning about the possibility of a hijack, with a message to 93 saying, "Beware any cockpit intrusion. 2 aircraft hit the World Trade Center." However, the pilot, Jason Dahl, apparently confused by the message, responded asking for confirmation. However, Jason would not get his confirmation, as mere minutes later, Flight 93 would enter a sharp dive as the terrorists began attempts to take control of the cockpit. By 9:30, after diving 500 feet in just 30 seconds, hijackers had managed to stabilize the plane and began to redirect the flight towards Washington. At 9:31, the hijackers would use the plane intercom system to deliver a message to panicking passengers. Similar claims were heard on Flight 11. However, unlike Flight 11, passengers weren't buying it. By the time Flight 93 had been hijacked, both Flight 11 and 175 had hit the Twin Towers, and media coverage was overwhelming. 10 passengers and 2 crew members managed to make phone calls to those on the ground, and multiple passengers were made aware of the other hijackings. One of such passengers was Tom Burnett, who made several phone calls to his wife, Dina Burnett. Tom explained that the plane had been hijacked by men claiming to have a bomb, but that he believed the bomb threat was a ruse to control the passengers. Dina informed him of the attacks on the World Trade Center, and Burnett replied that he overheard the hijackers talking about crashing his plane. He began asking her for information about the attacks, interrupting her from time to time to tell other nearby passengers. Burnett would end his final call with his wife by telling her that he and a group of other passengers were putting together a plan to retake the plane, telling his wife, "Don't worry, we're going to do something." By 9:57, after holding an impromptu vote on what to do, passengers began a revolt to retake control of the cockpit. Passengers are believed to have used a mobile food cart as a battering ram in an attempt to breach the cockpit doors. Meanwhile, hijackers rolled the plane to try to knock the passengers off balance. After a 6-minute-long struggle, Flight 93 would crash in a field in Somerset, Pennsylvania, killing all of those on board, but ultimately stopping the plane from reaching its intended target in Washington. This act of heroism saved hundreds of lives, and in 2014, the passengers of Flight 93 were posthumously granted the Congressional Gold Medal for this valiant act. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the other planes.
This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you! I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
A lot had changed in Afghanistan since the US last had involvement. After an exhausting 3-year-long civil war, the Taliban had come out on top as the de facto government of Afghanistan. The Taliban also would develop ties with Al-Qaeda, to the point in which nearly all Al-Qaeda operations were based in Afghanistan. Following the events of September 11th, just 9 days after the attacks, George Bush would address a joint session of Congress and demand the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda leaders so they could stand trial in the United States. Taliban officials would refuse this demand, requesting evidence of bin Laden's involvement in the attacks and insisting that any potential trial take place in an Afghan court. The Taliban were unwilling to surrender such an important ally, and it was clear that war was imminent. It was just a question of when. And on October 7, 2001, that question was answered with Operation Salvo, a large bombing campaign targeted at key Taliban and Al-Qaeda sites. American Special Forces would also be airlifted to the northeast of the country to make a deal with a collection of opposing groups known as the Northern Alliance. Although the Taliban were by far the most dominant force in the country, this was not always the case. And just a few years earlier, the Northern Alliance was the dominant force in the region. The Northern Alliance was more than happy to work with the US government in dismantling the Taliban regime. A total of 5,000 American troops had landed in the country, and with the aid of tens of thousands of rebel forces and a handful of other foreign allies, dismantling the Taliban government and taking up bin Laden seemed like it was going to be a breeze. By December 17th, barely even 2 months after the invasion had started, the US and rebel forces had fully occupied Afghanistan and had killed over 10,000 Taliban soldiers. How many Americans dead? 13. Everything seemed too easy. Sure, it seemed inevitable that the US would come out victorious in the end, but for a place called the Graveyard of Empires, you expect them to put up a little more of a fight. Little did they know. Although the Taliban certainly were no longer in control of Afghanistan, they were by no means defeated and continued to operate hidden away in valleys and small villages, far away from the opposition troops in Kabul and other large cities. And here they would remain for years, dormant, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim a country they saw as theirs. But in the meantime, the US had a lot of work to do. Over the next several years, the US would work with the newly formed Afghan government, supplying aid as well as military equipment and training. There were even plans to slowly withdraw troops from Afghanistan, until As the situation began to cool down in Afghanistan, more attention began to be drawn towards Iraq. Even before the attacks in the Twin Towers, removal of Saddam Hussein was a priority for the Bush administration. In fact, it was even something that George Bush had campaigned on. However, little more than basic plans would be made. That is, until September 11th. As the horrors of the day unfolded and the panic and chaos ensued, there was one man who, while the world was literally burning down around him, saw this not just as a disaster, but also as an opportunity. That man was Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was a zealot in the campaign to invade Iraq, and although he previously served as the envoy to Iraq, he was now continuously pushing for its invasion. As the NSA and other governmental organizations learned more about the attacks on 9/11, more information came out pointing towards Al-Qaeda being the culprit behind them. Rumsfeld, however, dismissed this, instead asking aides for the best info fast. Judged whether good enough to hit Saddam Hussein at the same time, not only Osama bin Laden. By the afternoon, Rumsfeld had ordered the Pentagon to prepare plans for invading Iraq. However, much to his dismay, it would take another 2 years for this invasion to actually begin. But in the meantime, there was a lot of work to do in the PR department. Members of the Bush administration would spend the next 2 years building the case for invading Iraq, insisting on a connection between Saddam Hussein's Iraqi government and Al-Qaeda. In 2002, Donald Rumsfeld would even announce that the US had bulletproof evidence that a Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda alliance existed. However, this evidence would never be released to the public. What would be released to the public, though, was the 9/11 Commission Report, an incredibly thorough, all-encompassing congressional report, and in all 500 pages of this report, there was absolutely no evidence linking an Al-Qaeda-Iraq connection. It's not just the 9/11 Commission Report that came to this conclusion. Additional declassified Department of Defense reports also failed to find any operational link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. Despite this, the Bush administration was still steadfast in its plans for invasion, and continued to make the case to the public for the invasion of Iraq, particularly with claims of weapons of mass destruction. On September 12, 2002, George Bush would stand before the United Nations and make a speech advocating for the search of Iraq for weapons of mass destruction. Old Georgie would get his wish, and United Nations Security Council Resolution 1284 would be passed, creating a commission for the purpose of searching Iraq for weapons of mass destruction. In late 2002 and early 2003, hundreds of weapon inspectors and other UN personnel would enter Iraq. And what they found was shocking. Absolutely nothing. Surely there couldn't be nothing. We just need more weapons inspectors and more intervention. Surely this poor, war-torn nation has had the ample time and resources to develop nuclear weapons, all while hiding it from the rest of the world. They must just be hiding them really well, or using trucks as mobile manufacturing sites, or a secret underground bunker. Even after months of searching, the Bush administration would refuse to accept there was simply no weapons of mass destruction. And they had done such a great job of convincing the public that the public too refused to accept this. And on March 19th, 2003, after receiving bipartisan support, George Bush would announce the invasion of Iraq. And within days, a small coalition of troops made landfall in the country. Among these were, of course, American soldiers, but also British, Australian, and Polish ones. This list of allies was noticeably shorter than in the previous war in Afghanistan, as many nations held reservations toward this invasion, seeing it as unjustified. France, in particular, threatened to use its UN Security Council veto to strike down any legislation supporting an invasion of Iraq. This infuriated many in the Bush administration, but they weren't going to let a little international law get in the way of a good invasion. But besides causing the French fries in the congressional cafeteria to be renamed Freedom Fries, this international condemnation seemed to have no effect. The US was unwilling to back down from its war efforts, and in the end, after a brief struggle, leaving tens of thousands dead, the Iraqi government would crumble within a month. Europeans weren't the only ones unhappy with the Iraq War. It also faced significant opposition at home. Although the Iraq Liberation Act passed Congress with support from both Democrats and Republicans, it didn't hold such unanimous support within the public. The US had invaded Iraq and it had absolutely nothing to show for it. No weapons of mass destruction, no secret underground bunkers, no evidence of an Al-Qaeda alliance, and as time passed and more people learned the true nature of the war, its, and George Bush's approval, went down and down and down. More and more people were becoming skeptical of the Bush administration. Rumsfeld, Cheney, and Bush seemed all too eager to get us into the war. But why? They seemed all too eager to use 9/11 as an excuse to do whatever they want. I mean, I get it. We're supposed to never forget. But at some point, enough is enough, right? As time passed and 9/11 became less of a reality and more of a memory, people began to look at it more skeptically, and they began to see it for the absurdity that it was. Hijacking 2 planes and flying them into skyscrapers? I mean, come on. This would fit better in a shitty YA novel than in a history book. There really isn't anything even remotely comparable to it in modern history. The reality of it just seemed so impossible to so many people. There's an idea in philosophy called Occam's razor. It basically goes that the simpler the solution, the more likely it is to be the correct one. And this idea has proven to be very useful. If you hear the clopping of hooves in the distance, it's more likely to be coming from a horse than a zebra. If you hear a loud bang on the 4th of July, it's probably fireworks and not a gunshot. And if you see a giant furry man walking through a forest in the middle of the day, it's probably just a guy in a suit. But what happens when the simplest solution is the wrong one, and reality is something different altogether? I think conspiracy theories get a bad rap. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot of really bogus, nonsensical ones about aliens, the shape of the earth, or other weird garbage. But people forget, a lot of things we take today as historical canon started out as conspiracy theories. Before Watergate was a national scandal, it was just something you'd overhear some hippies murmuring about. Before we knew MKUltra was a real thing that actually happened, we just knew of it through the hundreds of conspiracy theorists running LSD and government mind control. I could go on. Cigarette companies knowing they cause cancer, the FBI and the assassination of MLK, oil companies knowing about global warming. Almost all conspiracy theories relating to 9/11 fall under the umbrella of a horrendous act committed by one group to pin blame on another. Surely the US government would never even consider doing something like that. Operation Northwoods was a proposed CIA against American citizens. The proposal would call for violent terrorist attacks on American civilians and military targets, which would be used to justify the invasion of Cuba. Seem at all familiar? Operation Northwoods would ultimately be rejected by President Kennedy. However, there were other similar plans which were actually carried out. The sinking of the USS Maine as a justification for the Spanish-American War is one such example. But why do all this? What's the point? What good is a conspiracy without a motive? And here is where many conspiracy theories go wrong. Many of them will either have a non-existent or otherwise incredibly vague motive. Aliens, fluoride, chemtrails, flat earth. If you really want to be taken seriously, the reason behind your grand conspiracy better be something more than to sell more globes to people. Seriously, how much money do you think globe companies make? Certainly not enough to pay off the hundreds of thousands of people from all across the earth just so they can sell you a $20 spinning ball. I mean, seriously, can you even name a company that makes globes? But unlike where so many other conspiracy theories go wrong, there is no shortage of potential motives behind 9/11. And after year of hearing about another war in the Middle East, many went from cynical to skeptical. As general distrust of the Bush administration grew, naturally, so too did 9/11 conspiracy theories. A movement which was originally composed of Vietnam-era anti-war types soon shifted to what New York Magazine described as terra incognita. This movement was neither left nor right. It was something new entirely. It was where left and right meet, fusing 60s countercultural distrust with the don't tread on me variety, and this new lot would leave no stone unturned. Many of these motives involved the Iraq War in some form or the other. While the invasion of Afghanistan seemed justified to many Americans, the invasion of Iraq, on the other hand, did not. In addition to being put off by the general mismanagement of the conflict, many Americans were suspicious of the Bush administration's seeming eagerness to enter the war, the reason for which was still unclear. Many felt that there had to be a grander reason behind it all, something more than looking for WMDs, which we knew didn't exist. Maybe it was due to bribes from weapons contractors, or some other foreign powers who had vested interest in the region. Maybe they just really wanted to remove Saddam so badly that they'd go to such extreme measures to justify war. Or maybe it's something far more simple, like access to Iraqi oil fields. Possible motives don't stop at just Iraq, though. Others believe the attack was used to justify more surveillance legislation, such as the Patriot Act under guise of security. Of course, there are some more off-the-rail ideas, such as the establishment of a new global world order. Ooh, scary. But often, the broader the justification, the shallower the evidence gets. The collapse of the Twin Towers raised a lot of questions for people. Why did it take so long for the buildings to collapse? And why did it collapse in the way it did? To many people, the destruction of the Twin Towers much more closely resembled a controlled demolition rather than an unforeseen collapse. And over the years, many people would speculate that, in addition to suffering damage from the plane attacks, the Twin Towers had been destroyed from the inside. The source of which, Theories range from dynamite to miniaturized nuclear suitcase bombs. However, the evidence for this is suspect to say the least. Besides anecdotal evidence of people working in the buildings in the days before the attack, where they supposedly installed bombs which would later be detonated, the crux of the bombs theory relies on the idea that jet fuel can't melt steel beams. A phrase which has become something of a dog whistle or rallying cry for 9/11 conspiracy theorists. And while this phrase isn't exactly false, it isn't exactly true either. While yes, the fire caused by the plane crash probably wouldn't be hot enough to liquidize the steel beams, it certainly would be hot enough to substantially weaken them, which would ultimately cause the building to collapse. Even this was far from the most deranged theory. Somehow, despite all the evidence of the contrary, there are people who believe there were no planes at all, and that instead, the towers in the Pentagon were struck by missiles. How would that even be possible? It's not like anyone would even have access to those sort of... Before 9/11, George W. Bush was not a very well-respected president. Many people thought that he was not deserving of the presidency, and only won it because of his father. Even his election was contentious. The 2000 election was decided by Florida, of which Bush won by only 537 votes, by far the lowest in history. This should have triggered a recount. This was blocked by the conservative-controlled Supreme Court. To make matters worse, the governor of Florida was Bush's brother. Safe to say, many people in government had their doubts about Bush, and his antics and general aloofness would only amplify this. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that Cheney, Rumsfeld, or some other official went behind Bush's back to orchestrate something like the Twin Towers attack. Of course, the CIA is also another prime suspect, with their previous involvements in proposals such as Operation Northwoods and others which have not been disclosed to the public. The CIA also has previous connections and experience in Afghanistan. It's certainly plausible that they could have at least helped Al-Qaeda get the ball rolling. This idea is further supported by the fact that Flight 77 struck the only side of the Pentagon which had been reinforced, either an incredibly fortunate coincidence or simply made to look like one. Although the CIA is probably the most plausible candidate for a potential conspiracy, it is far from the most popular one. To many people, it seems obvious that George Bush would have known about any potential plot, but honestly, I'm not so sure. I would imagine that any conspirators would probably want to keep Bush clean, so he wouldn't be implicated if their plot were revealed to the public. And also, keeping as few people in the know as possible would certainly minimize this possibility. Of course, it's also possible that Bush did know and may have even rejected it. Yet, it was carried out anyways, despite his disapproval. Maybe it wasn't even the government at all, but they simply allowed for the attacks anyways. Even if the CIA wasn't wiring money to Al-Qaeda, that doesn't mean they couldn't have been aware of the planned attacks. Maybe it's possible they just turned a blind eye to the whole thing and let bin Laden have his way. Ultimately, there's probably no way of knowing either way. If there truly was a conspiracy, any evidence of it has been long shredded.
But hey, that's just a theory.
In the end, I don't think these conspiracies are true. They can be fun, but in the hundreds of hours of research I've done for this video, I found nothing but anecdotal evidence to back them up. This isn't a controlled demolition. It just looks like that because the building collapsed from top to bottom. And while the steel beams that held up the tower weren't literally liquidized, they certainly were bent and weakened enough to the point of being useless. There's a reason we call these things conspiracy theories. They really just don't have any evidence. Still, it can be interesting to look at them though. In doing so, we can learn a lot about the general distrust in the government in the post-9/11 era. And although these conspiracy theories aren't real, the issues facing people were. This was a tough time for a lot of Americans. People lost their jobs, their houses, and even their families. And many desperate people went looking for something that wasn't there, a reason behind all this. Sure, they knew how the recession and wars in the Middle East happened, but why? How could those in charge, who were supposed to know better, let this happen? People like to assume that those in power are competent, but often they are just as fallible as ourselves. And what we often chalk up to malice can just as often be simply incompetence.
Now watch this drive.
But to many, that reality can be just as terrifying and hard to accept as any conspiracy theory. George Bush should never have been in a position to make these sort of mistakes. He wouldn't have been qualified to control the country in a time of peace, let alone a time of crisis. And his 2 terms were some of the most contentious since the end of the Cold War. It wasn't just 9/11. Bush also had to answer the worst natural disaster in US history, Katrina, as well as the worst economic disaster since the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis. The man simply lacked vision for solving these problems and didn't have the charisma to rally those behind him. But what can you really expect? The man's only previous experience in government, his time serving as the governor of Texas, came off of his father's victory in the presidency. And his presidential election in 2000 was again contentious to say the least. Still, I don't think Bush had ill intent, and much of his controversies can be attributed to his cabinet of questionable characters he made the mistake of surrounding himself with. Bush certainly holds some accountability for the mistakes of his 2 terms, but placing the blame solely on him is not only unfair, but it means failing to hold others accountable. Even now, 20 years after the attacks, it's amazing just how much of a cornerstone in our culture the 9/11 attacks represent. This sort of stuff just doesn't happen in America. For millions of people, this would be the closest they'd get to experiencing war firsthand, which is part of why it has been such a big target for conspiracy theorists. Even 2 decades later, there is still so much emotion behind the attacks, much more so than many other major events of that era, such as the massive Y2K phenomenon, which has since been reduced to a punchline. Still, even the most potent and emotional events will ultimately be reduced to history, losing the emotion and memories of the event. For instance, look at the Titanic. For decades, in the early 1900s, many people held the disaster in a similar vein to how we look at 9/11 today. If you were to even joke about it, people would be revolted, and even faithful adaptations of the disaster were seen as too soon. Yet today, I doubt you'd see someone up in arms over a Titanic joke. It'll be interesting to see in the following decades if 9/11 succumbs to the same fate. We've already entered an era where 9/11 isn't quite so taboo, with the event even becoming somewhat of a staple in internet meme culture. For now though, these jokes are only safe within the anonymity of the internet, with even the bravest of comedians steering clear of them. But it seems inevitable that with enough time, this taboo, too, will pass. And never forget will become I for gore. Or maybe the emotion of the event will live on. Maybe there is something so unique about the horror of that day, something that will stick with not only us, but those who come after us. But in the end, if there were really some greater force behind the 9/11 attacks, personally, I'm not ruling out George Carlin.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway.